first session is called From Scientific Materialism to Monistic Idealism. Yeah, I love this quote. I mean, there's, I often, think like in terms of like my style of thinking is often very like quotey. Like I love to sort of mull on different quotes from different theorists, intellectuals, and philosophers who I really am, moved by. Gerald Hurd is not very well known, I guess. He was an English kind of polymath. He definitely wrote a couple of fascinating books, but yeah, Civilization is the shadow cast by man's evolving consciousness. I think it's a brilliant, formulation. And, what it suggests is that if our, collective consciousness was to evolve past the point where it is right now, that could also have a tremendous transformative effect on our civilization as a whole. And yeah, maybe we could see ourselves in a kind of, civilizational crisis, consciousness crisis, which are forcing that kind of transformation. And yeah, the basic kind of concept that I want to discuss today is that we are in the midst of this paradigm shift where we're coming out of this scientific materialism, which developed over the last like 400, 500 years, going back to Newton, Descartes, and so on. And we're moving into something else. And different thinkers and scientists have been trying to name this something else. I mean, for the physicist David Bohm, he talked about the holographic universe. Robert Lanza, who we're going to look at, talked about biocentrism in his work. And Amit Goswami uses a term called monistic idealism, which for me was very exciting because it's actually also the term that one of my great kind of intellectual heroes, the visionary philosopher Rudolf Steiner, used in his original kind of philosophical dissertation, The Philosophy of Freedom, which was actually an effort in, kind of like, I think he was probably writing in like the 1880s or something, to refute Kantian dualism. Yeah, so some of the basic premises of scientific materialism is that only matter is real, matter is what exists. Consciousness arises out of the physical universe. It was kind of an accident or a byproduct of ever-increasing evolutionary complexity. So it's essentially an epiphenomenon, and it's entirely based in the physical brain. So from a reductive, like from the most like strong perspective of a scientific materialist, there really couldn't be things like telepathy, telekinesis, synchronicities don't have any meaning. The universe is just a sort of random accident. And I think that the worldview of scientific materialism is still the dominant worldview, certainly in our institutions, our academies, and it's kind of what drives like this whole kind of technological worldview, transhumanism, the singularity, this idea that, I mean, to me, it's actually quite interesting because I feel that the ideology of the singularity, which has become very dominant in Silicon Valley and the tech world, is actually something that borrowed a lot from, the eschatology of Christianity, and this idea, it's sort of like the fallen matter that's going to be redeemed, but in the singularity worldview, it's this sort of technological redemption. Like we're going to develop immortality by merging with machines, by uploading our consciousnesses onto computers and so on. Yeah, so it's very interesting that even that scientific materialist worldview ultimately seems to be like it's moving towards this kind of kind of eschatological salvationist idea. So yeah, and so the alternative to scientific materialism that we're going to look at is called monistic idealism, and that posits the idea that it's actually only consciousness exists. Consciousness is the fundamental reality, and what we experience as the physical universe is kind of a projection of consciousness. So the physical material universe actually emerges from, you call it the plenum or the source field of consciousness. And also an aspect of the monistic idealism paradigm is that this consciousness is indivisible, it's unitary. The Hindus called it one without a second. And although this consciousness is ultimately indivisible and unitary, it requires the kind of like temporary illusion of separate selves, separate beings like ourselves, because that's the only way it would be able to create sort of a subject-object dichotomy, and then kind of reflect upon itself, explore, learn, and so on. So yes, that's kind of some of the basic ideas that we're going to look at. And yeah, I was mentioning a little bit about my my journey, which I've spoken about a lot in all sorts of different ways and written about. But yeah, I've written a number of books. My first book came out in 2002. It was called Breaking Open the Head. And I started writing that book in the late 90s during this kind of existential emergency. Up until that point, I was a materialist and a skeptic. Even though my parents were artists, they had no religious or spiritual beliefs. Yeah, I began to find this kind of intolerable. I didn't really see the point of existence. And it seemed like, the people that I knew were just distracting themselves, with drugs or with material ambitions and so on. I was kind of lucky because my mother, when she was young, had been part of a counterculture movement called the Beats. And that included thinkers and writers like Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs and Gregory Corso and Jack Kerouac, of course. And these guys in the 40s had kind of had a similar freak out where they had sort of recognized when they were young that it was almost like consciousness wasn't present in the world, in the institutions, and the political structures. People were just kind of talking out of received ideas, like indoctrination, out of their conditioning. And so they kind of went on a journey to excavate kind of consciousness, spontaneity. And they used all these different methods. They used, drugs, meditation, sexuality, spontaneous writing, and so on. So in a way they were trying to recapture kind of a spontaneous flow state that they felt, had been kind of lost to humanity. And they went to the Amazon. I mean, Burroughs was one of the first Western, kind of artists to explore ayahuasca. Then Ginsberg, explored ayahuasca. Ginsberg also became kind of like an advocate for LSD and Eastern mysticism. He was involved with the Hare Krishnas. He helped launch that movement. Then he became a Tibetan Buddhist, was very involved with the Tibetan Buddhism. So, the Beats basically were all about, direct experience, unmediated experience as being kind of the only experience you can really trust. And they that they also had mystical experiences. I mean, Kerouac was very much a Buddhist, kind of a Western Buddhist. As I said, Ginsberg also became a Tibetan Buddhist in the end. So having that in kind of my pedigree, because my mother had been involved with that group, when I was in my existential emergency, I was open to this idea of exploring more direct connections. And I remembered my psychedelic experiences in college. That became like my path of, kind of self-discovery, inquiry. I ended up going to West Africa. I went through a tribal initiation into a group called the Bwiti, who use iboga as their sacrament. Iboga is kind of like the indigenous psychedelic of that region of Gabon and Cameroon and so on. And during that experience with iboga, I was still more or less a materialist, although questioning, wondering if there might be other layers or levels of existence. A lot of the experience was very psychological, psychoanalytical. I had lying down, I had all these visions of my early childhood. I went back into scenes, that were crucial in my kind of development, whether it was like my parents fighting or different illnesses and so on. But the really strong sense was that there was a intelligence in the plant medicine that was sort of having a conversation with me, was showing things in a certain way and in a certain sequence. And along with that, there were certain other kind of things that happened. I mean, one of the things that stayed with me is one of the Bwiti shamans told me that he could see the spirit of my mother's mother hovering around me, and that she had died very recently, but she was still very possessive, and she was sort of clinging on to me, and also wasn't letting me go into certain parts of the spirit worlds. And I felt kind of blocked in a strange way. And what was amazing to me about him saying that was that my mother's mother was actually the only grandparent that I'd known at all. All the others had passed away before I was born, and that actually she had died within a year. And I hadn't told anybody, on that voyage. Nobody knew that was the case. So, so a number of things about that, certainly struck me. One was it seemed that this, shaman, or in their term, Naganga is their word for shaman, was able to access information about me, from a kind of transpersonal domain. So for that to be possible, then there would have to be some sense in which consciousness could extend outside of the body in some way. And then the other was that, he, if I was to take him seriously, he had this perception of this kind of spirit, of my mother's mother, that was able to continue on in some way, after her death. So yeah, so that stayed with me. And as I wrote Breaking Up in the Head, I had many different psychedelic experiences, and the Amazon and Mexico, and festivals in the US, and many other types of explorations. And I had many paranormal psychic experiences that ultimately forced me to kind of break through the scientific materialist paradigm and recognize that from my perspective, based on experience, the deep structure of reality is closer to what somebody like Carl Jung talks about, or something like these shamanic cultures talk about, that there are these kind of different layers of reality. There are, psychic capacities, there are archetypal forces that move through the collective psyche, there are, spirits and so on. I mean, it's hard to articulate exactly, but a lot of my work has been an effort to try to kind of, I guess, find the juncture between our modern Western logic and language and these types of direct experiences that you can have. So my second book was 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, where basically once I had recognized that these indigenous cultures had an access to a whole realm of knowledge that modern technocratic society had totally suppressed and rejected, I then realized that these cultures, had knowledge that was important to us, and we had to revalue it and try to understand it in our own way. And I also discovered that many of these cultures have prophecies about this time that we're in being a time of very intense transformation. Cultures like the Hopi talk about it, sort of transition from the fourth world to the fifth world, or the Aztecs talk about the age of the fifth sun, the age of the sixth sun. So 2012 was a very deep dive to try to understand, how these prophetic knowledge systems related to the time that we're in now. And I, in that book, I looked a lot at kind of, metaphysics, Frida Kapro's The Tao of Physics, the relationship between kind of indigenous cosmologies, Eastern metaphysics, and modern Western science and quantum physics and so on. So that in a way, was sort of the groundwork in a way for what we're talking about today. And then my third book came out about 10 years later. That book was called How Soon Is Now? And in that book, it was basically for me, my books have always followed kind of like to me, it seems like a very rational progress in a way, because I first wanted to understand was there anything else outside of the Western kind of narrow scientific worldview. I discovered that there were these other dimensions and other realities, which we'll talk about in more depth over the course of the month. I then realized that we undervalued indigenous knowledge and kind of suppressed and ridiculed and dismissed it, and that these cultures were telling us something very profound about the time that we're in now, that we needed to understand, how, figure out how to listen to them, how to learn from them, and so on. And then when I understood that, that these prophecies were suggesting that we were going through this, intense planetary transformation, transformation of human consciousness, destruction, recreation process, that led me to want to think about that, not just on a metaphysical level, but then actually on a practical level. Like, okay, if human society has to reconfigure itself to deal with the ecological emergency, what does that actually look like? I felt there wasn't, and for me, one of the ways I've written books is always kind of like, I feel this kind of like, almost like anxiety, this like uncomfortability. It's like there's something that I feel needs to be understood in the culture. And then, if I go to a bookstore or a library, I can't find that thing that it's like missing a vitamin or something. So then ultimately I realized that like maybe I'm the one who has to, create that thing or create that vitamin or something. So, How Soon Is Now was my effort to kind of think about what this new paradigm would be and kind of the systems and structures that we would have to kind of put in place around this ecological emergency. And, for me, as I mentioned earlier, something that I had realized was that because the scientific materialist worldview, automatically engenders kind of separation and nihilism, we probably can't, fundamentally address, what we're doing ecologically without a new paradigm or a new worldview. And so that's why I think, the subject matter that we're looking at this month is so incredibly important. I think if there was to be a revolution in the modern psyche, away from materialism, both in its scientific, technological form, but also in terms of mass consumption and consumerism, and this idea that you're going to sort of fill the inner void through, objects or even experiences, that could provide the basis for a healthy future culture for humanity. So I think it's actually very, very important and very deep in that sense. Terence McKenna has been one of my philosophical inspirations for a long time. I don't agree with everything. I mean, he's extremely entertaining and mesmerizing as a thinker and speaker. This is one quote that has sort of resonated with me. Our institutions or epistemologies are bankrupt and exhausted. We must start anew and hope that with the help of shamanically inspired personalities, we can cultivate the ancient mystery once again. The logos can be unleashed, and the voice that spoke to Plato and Parmenides and Heraclitus can speak again in the minds of modern people. When it does, the alienation will be ended because we will have become the alien. This is the promise that is held out. It may seem to some a nightmare vision, but all historical changes of immense magnitude have a charged emotional quality. They propel people into a completely new world. Okay, so essentially, there is, as we're going to explore in subsequent weeks. I mean, I decided to start the seminar from more of this high level, kind of inquiry around, the scientific paradigm and quantum physics and so on, for reasons which I hope will become clear. Because I feel unless we have some coherence around that, then the evidence almost doesn't really matter. And in fact, when I wrote this piece for this contest, they were asking for the best evidence for life after death or consciousness after death. And as we'll explore, there's a lot of incredibly fascinating evidence, like children who remember their, past lives and early childhood, very specifically, and professors who've taken them to meet the families and shown that they have similar birthmarks and so on. Extraordinary evidence from mediumship, where people are given like privileged information, related to that person, or able to speak with somebody in kind of the discourse that they used to have when they were alive and so on, even though the medium didn't really have access to that discourse or understand it. Near-death experience, which we can, which we'll go through in some depth. Although there's a question, whether those are actually, showing us insight into an after-death realm, or if it's more kind of like a, bardo of the living realm in a way. But all of that evidence is going to always be, dismissed unless we kind of, address the underlying paradigm. And that means somehow finding our way past reductive scientific materialism. So Chris Carter is a wonderful writer in these whole areas. He has a trilogy of books, Science and Psychic Phenomena, Science and the Near-Death Experience, and Science and the Afterlife. And in Science and the Psychic Phenomena, he goes through all the different arguments, common arguments made by skeptics to refute psychic phenomena, and kind of, refutes them, quite effectively. But he also points out that, even though if you have a mass of favorable evidence that exists, that can hardly be disputed if one has ever taken the trouble to look at it, but it doesn't really matter, because the conclusions to which the evidence seems to point, are only going to be depending on the validity of the skeptical objections and by implication of their underlying philosophical and scientific assumptions. So the understanding of the afterlife, the understanding of psychic phenomena, all these areas are contingent upon, digging down into this paradigm. Then, we've seen it so far. Somebody was last night. I was talking to somebody about kind of like the debates between like Deepak Chopra and Sam Harris and so on, which ended up, with kind of Deepak looking kind of, dismissible. It requires a lot of subtlety and a lot of work on sort of rhetorics and language to kind of, reach a level where, we can kind of, contest the scientific materialist paradigm at its own kind of level in a way. And then there's, intrinsic, there's at least up to now, there's been these kind of intrinsic aspects of these other areas, which are make them more complex and more difficult. George Hansen has this wonderful book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, where he talks about how psi phenomena, paranormal phenomena, supernatural, tend to be fundamentally linked to destructuring, change, transition, disorder, the ephemeral, fluidity, ambiguity, the blurring of boundaries. And by contrast, the phenomena are repressed or excluded with structure, routine, stasis, regularity, precision, rigidity, and clear demarcation. So kind of he believes that out of their own nature, they tend to fall, outside of institutional structures. They have a sort of subversive quality in and of themselves. Now, I actually don't agree with Hansen ultimately. I think that this is the case when you have a civilization that's founded on a kind of scientific materialist worldview, then of course these are, anything psi, anything paranormal are destructuring elements or subversive elements. But, we do see, complex societies that have completely integrated psychic phenomena and, reincarnation and understanding of the mechanics of reincarnation. And obviously, one of the most significant of those and probably the most sophisticated is Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, which has developed a whole science of reincarnation over 1,000 years and so on. And also has a place for different types of psychic phenomena, understands their value, their meaning, and so on. So, but, from where we are now in our current cultural paradigm, I think Hansen's work, makes a very good point. Similarly, Colin Wilson wrote a book about the afterlife where he noted that the evidence for life after death shall always be strong enough to reassure the converted, but never conclusive enough to have the slightest influence on the unbelievers. So that's quite fascinating. It like falls into this, kind of permanent twilight, this gray area. And because I think it's so crucial, that we somehow push it, above that, out of that twilight, and into the sort of clear light of conscious inquiry. And I think it's possible to do that. It's just still kind of like a struggle to get there, if that makes sense. William James, who we'll come back to later, notes that a concrete test of what is real, of what is really true, has never been agreed on. I just love that comment. I think it's very significant. I mean, one question is, what kind of reasoning, could be accepted from a scientific framework for the existence of a form of afterlife or for reincarnation or something. I mean, you're never gonna, obviously, you'd have to die yourself to, how else could you prove that there is or isn't an afterlife, right? And so we could look at it, for instance, we don't actually know for certain that anybody besides ourselves actually has a subjective consciousness, right? Like we live under the assumption that everybody does have subjective awareness like ourselves and are beings like ourselves, who have free will to a certain extent, or at least the, expression of it. But that actually is ultimately, based on reasoning, on deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, inference. We see how other people react, how that person reacts to pain the way I do. They react to pleasure the way I do. They reason as I do, and we make a certain set of kind of judgments around them and around ourselves, and we're like, okay, we live in a world of other people, where other people equally as I do have consciousness and will. So in the case of near death, I mean, in the case of kind of establishing kind of the possibility of reincarnation in the afterlife and so on, we could use the same type of reasoning. I mean, we're never going to know with 100% certainty, but on the other hand, a concrete test of what is really true has never been agreed on, and perhaps can never be agreed on. So science is always, in that sense, building theories and hypotheses and probabilities. This is just one. I mean, as we'll talk about in future weeks, there are many, many books on this topic that and many philosophers and scientists, like Chris Carter, who did incredible amounts of research and became completely, convinced that there's some form of afterlife, that the evidence really supports it. And they always come up in the same kind of level of frustration at the impossibility of having this taken seriously by the culture at large. So this is, just one example of that. Dr. Jean-Jacques Charbonnier, who wrote a book called 7 Reasons to Believe in the Afterlife. According to skeptics and detractors, the existence of a life after this life, and therefore of a hereafter, has not been scientifically proven, because for them, the experience of a near-death experience is a phenomenon that is observable only by those undergoing it. The NDE is, of course, not reproducible in a laboratory or measurable by equipment designed for this purpose. Since these two conditions of being reproducible and measurable, which are deemed to be essential for a proof to be scientific, are missing, the hereafter, therefore, is not about to be recognized as a scientific reality. Reasoning in this way, scientific thought becomes frighteningly reductionist and authenticating what belongs to the realm of the real. Yeah, so there is a level of philosophical work that somehow needs to be done to move the needle here. And it's also the case that there are more and more forms of evidence, even around psychic phenomena, paranormality. If you look at the works of people like Dean Radin and Rupert Sheldrake and so on, it's almost like there's an alternative, kind of academy of thinkers and researchers and philosophers, who really, I would say it's been, the existence of psychic phenomena has been very much demonstrated. Obviously, if you have the personal experience of it, you don't doubt it anymore. You actually know it, rather than just think it. So I thought we would go back and talk about the formation of the modern scientific worldview, which developed over the last, say, 5 centuries. Just a little quick review. I mean, Copernicus, was the one who realized that the Earth, was not at the center of the universe or of the solar system. René Descartes developed the concept of mind-body dualism. I think, therefore I am. Isaac Newton, developed the theory of gravity, and Charles Darwin developed evolution. So it's just kind of, I think, useful to get the sort of spread of how these ideas have developed over the last centuries. This is a beautiful image of Newton from William Blake. Isaac Newton. I actually just love this painting of Newton, because obviously these people just, when we think about them, they're just these kind of like abstractions. But when I look at this painting of him, he looks like a cool young dude, like a hipster alchemist dude, like the people that I know in England, like my friend David Luke, who runs, Breaking Convention and, studies, the paranormal and so on. He just kind of looks like an awesome, character somehow. But anyway, yeah, so some of Newton's ideas is that, there was, an absolute space that continues on, in a kind of unvarying way. And similarly, there was an absolute time. So they were separate, but equivalent domains. One of the philosophers who I worked with a lot in the 2012 book is Jean Gebser, who wrote a book called The Ever-Present Origin. And Gebser kind of looked at the evolution of consciousness in terms of, kind of these different structures in a very kind of Germanic way. He talked about the aboriginal structure of consciousness, the magical structure, the mythological structure of consciousness, then the mental rational structure. And he believed that we were currently at the end of the mental rational structure, and that we were moving kind of towards a crisis that would lead to a mutational break into a new structure of consciousness that he called the integral or the aperspectival. And Gebser said that in this mental rational structure, part of what had happened to us is that we'd become kind of fascinated by space and matter in a way that wasn't the case for the people in the mythological or aboriginal structures. And so in the Renaissance, we discovered perspective. Suddenly we kind of located ourselves in space, and in a sense, we became so kind of haunted or fascinated by space. It's almost like we got possessed by space, and we began to take this idea of a spatialized, materialized universe and kind of extend that idea to things that actually don't work in that way, like time. So time is not really an invariable linear extension in the same way that space is. There are different ways to think about the nature of time. That's just one of them. So yeah, so Gebser felt that this kind of misperception of time that characterized the mental rational structure was leading to this sort of crisis and this breakthrough into another form of consciousness that he called integral or aperspectival. So yeah, so Newton was a seminal figure in kind of seeing space and time as these separate equivalent domains that were kind of absolute in this sense. And similarly the mechanistic worldview, the kind of clockwork universe, linear cause and effect, these all became more and more after Newton kind of the basic understanding of the modern psyche. There were developments, but obviously the breakthrough was Einstein, who realized that space and time are not separate domains. They're totally interrelated in the space-time continuum, where physical objects have a gravitational force, they curve space, time bends as well, time is subjective to the perceiver. Mendel Sachs and other physicists said relativity theory implies that the space and time coordinates are only the elements of a language that is used by an observer to describe his environment. So that was like the first big shift. I could say, we can look at the 20th century as these kind of successive scientific revolutions, whereas before, maybe there was one every, 300 years, suddenly there was like, 5 in the last century. Werner Heisenberg, we're super lucky that Heisenberg, who was a Nazi, didn't develop the nuclear bomb, before we did, but he developed the uncertainty principle. He realized that, with quantum objects such as photons and electrons, it was impossible to determine both their position and momentum at the same time. And if you try to observe the momentum, then the quantum element appears as a wave. If you try to observe or determine the position, the quantum object appears as a particle. But in fact, they're neither or both at the same time. The path of the electron comes into existence when we observe it, Heisenberg said. And Niels Bohr, his collaborator, isolated material particles are abstractions. Their properties only being definable and observable through their interactions with other systems. So this is from Heisenberg's book, The Physicist's Conception of Nature. And yeah, it takes quite a considerable effort to kind of integrate this understanding. And it's only been 50, 70 years that we've had this new understanding. So maybe that makes sense that we're still integrating it. We can no longer speak of the behavior of the particle independently of the process of observation. As a final consequence, the natural laws formulated mathematically in quantum theory no longer deal with the elementary particles themselves with our knowledge of them. Nor is it any longer possible to ask whether or not these particles exist in space and time objectively. When we speak of the picture of nature in the exact science of our age, we do not mean a picture of nature so much as a picture of our relationships with nature. Science no longer confronts nature as an objective observer, but sees itself as an actor in this interplay between man and nature. The scientific method of analyzing, explaining, and classifying has become conscious of its limitations, which arise out of the fact that by its intervention, science alters and refashions the object of investigation. In other words, method and object can no longer be separated. Yeah. By its intervention, science alters and refashions the object of investigation. So we're actually always changing, participating, even when we're just trying to observe. So some of the kind of outline of some of the discoveries of quantum physics: that photons and electrons are not solid things, but probability waves spreading through space. Photons and electron wave packets are found at more than one place at the same time. They only become definite particles when an observation is made. Quantum jumps: electrons can vanish from one point and appear at another without passing through this space in between. Non-locality, that's a critical one. Once correlated quantum objects remain linked despite vast distances. If the probability, I have this. If one side of the connected object is collapsed to make an observation, the other object is affected as well. The change happens instantly without any space for a message to be sent. And what this means is that the objects are not connected in the normal way through space-time. They're connected through a transcendent domain. They're inherently and inextricably linked. Macro objects are also made up of quantum phenomena. They seem solid because of their mass and their scale. The probability waves spread out slowly. And the material physical world only comes into existence when a conscious observer makes an observation. And a corollary of that, there's ultimately only one consciousness that observes and chooses. The existence of a four-dimensional space-time continuum means that what we perceive as the linear direction of time is only an illusion created by our particular perspective. Arthur Eddington is a physicist. He said, events do not happen, they are just there, and we come across them. Eddington also said that the universe ultimately is made up of mind stuff rather than matter, reflecting identical to kind of the Eastern mysticism, mystical perspective that the I am that the underlying reality is actually consciousness. Shoot, I can't. In space-time, everything that for each of us constitutes past and present and future is given n block. Each observer, as his time passes, discovers, so to speak, different slices of space-time which appear to him as successive aspects of the material reality. Though in reality, the entirety of events constituting space-time exists prior to his knowledge of them. So once again, these physicists, recognized the kind of philosophical transformation that their discoveries led to, and wrestled with it at depth, tried to explain it, tried to understand it, and many beautiful formulations. The model of space-time in relativistic physics is the timeless space of a higher dimension in which all events are interconnected, but the connections in themselves are not causal. Instead of linear cause and effect, the link between events in quantum mechanics is probabilistic and discontinuous, defined by the perceptions of a conscious observer. I think very few Western thinkers before 20th century quantum physics could go into this level of understanding. I mean, one of them is definitely Nietzsche, who understood that cause and effect was actually something that was a human construct that we kind of imprinted or imagined onto the physical universe. Nietzsche said, wrote, "In the in itself, there is nothing of causal connections, of necessity, or of psychological non-freedom. There, the effect does not follow the cause. There is no rule or law. It is we alone who have devised cause, sequence, for each other, relativity, constraint, number, law, freedom, motive, and purpose. And when we project and mix the symbol world into things as if it existed in itself, we act once more as we've always acted, mythologically." So just to reiterate, some of the postulates. I mean, Niels Bohr noted that those who are not shocked when they first come across quantum theory have not understood it. According to what, they're postulating, time, space, and consciousness are intimately interrelated and inseparable. And there exists a higher dimension outside of our perception of space-time in which everything is interconnected and happens at once. Then actually, if we look at like string theory, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, there may be, multiple, various higher dimensions, or more intensive fine dimensions, subtler dimensions. Matter, is largely non-material. If you blow up an atom to the size of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, its center would be the size of a grain of salt, the nucleus. Electrons cannot be considered objects in the traditional sense of the term. They don't exist the way matter exists, but only evince tendencies to exist. John Archibald Wheeler, another amazing physicist of the 20th century, who came up with the delayed choice experiment, which we'll look at. Participant is the incontrovertible new concept given by quantum mechanics. It strikes down the observer of classical theory, the man who stands safely behind the thick glass wall and watches what goes on without taking part. It can't be done, quantum mechanics says it. Wheeler asks, may the universe in some sense be brought into being by the participation of those who participate? And he postulates that the universe is brought into being by the conscious observer. Wheeler also said, there is no space-time, there is no time, there is no before, there is no after. The question, what happens next, is without meaning. So as Capra discovered in Tao of Physics, the quantum physicists, through their kind of experimental efforts into the to discovering kind of the underlying nature of the physical world, ended up in kind of like a Zen Buddhism kind of framework with all these paradoxes. Like time and no time. David Bohm, very interesting physicist. He developed the concept of the holographic universe. He proposed that the universe and the brain both have holographic principles and how they function, and they may actually be the projections of kind of a two-dimensional surface, even. And this was F. David Peat, wrote a biography of Bohm. The universe, according to Bohm, actually has two faces, or more precisely two orders. The explicit order, the explicate order corresponding to the physical world we know it in the day-to-day reality, and a deeper, more fundamental order, which Bohm calls the implicate order. The implicate order could be described as the vast hollow movement. We see only the surface of this movement as it presents, or I can't see that word, from moment to moment in time and space. What we see in the world, the explicate order, is more than the surface of the implicate order as it unfolds. So for Bohm, there is an explicit and an implicate order, implicate order, and the universe itself is like a hologram, or functions on holographic principles. Just very quickly, just to refresh, so we keep it in our minds, the double slit experiment, which is considered kind of the, one of the foundational experiments of quantum physics. You had these electrons, there were two slits. The electrons appear as these kind of interference patterns, wave patterns. If you're just observing their kind of momentum, if you fire them one by one, they turn back into particles. So this was like this essential paradox. As Friedrich Capra notes, and also Goswami, you can't say they're waves, you can't say they're particles, you can't say they're not waves, you can't say they're not particles. It ends up being very much like Nagarjuna's kind of precepts about the ultimate nature of reality, where it does not exist, does not exist, does not both exist and not exist, nor does it neither exist and not exist. More complex was the delayed choice experiment, where it was kind of similar, where you're shooting these photons, this photon beam splits up by these mirrors. and the patterns cross back over. And they found that there was a decision at the very last moment whether or not to insert a mirror, which allowed them to measure the wave aspect. And so it would have been when the light had already traveled past the point of splitting, thought of, if you consider them as ordinary Newtonian objects. But when they inserted that mirror, it always shows the wave aspect. When they don't insert it, it showed the particle aspect. It seemed as if the light quanta was responding instantly and retroactively. But as Goswami talks about in, I believe, the Self-Aware Universe, the wave splits whenever there are two available paths. When we choose to observe the photon in one path, our collapsing the wave exerts a non-local influence on the wave in the other path and negates the possibility of a photon being seen in that other path. Such a non-local influence may seem retroactive, but we're influencing only possibilities in potentia. There is no breakdown of causality because there cannot be a signal transmitted in this way. So Goswami points out there's no paradox in the delayed choice experiment if we give up the idea there is a fixed and independent material world, even when we are not observing it. So when we're not observing, when there's no conscious observer, the material world, sort of becomes probability waves. And as soon as the conscious observer turns up, it collapses back into definable objects, discrete objects, and so on. Another formulation of this was the Schrodinger's cat hypothesis. The idea was that if you have a cat in a sealed box with a sort of radioactive particle that probabilistically is going to switch on or off, if it switches on, then a poison is released and then kills the cat. But until you open the box, if there's 50% chance that poison was released, until you open the box, the cat is both dead and alive, or neither, both dead and alive. So the interpretations of the Copenhagen interpretation, a system stops being a superposition of states and becomes either one or the other when an observation takes place. Or the many worlds interpretation, which is essentially that every decision leads to a split and creates like a new parallel universe. When the box is open, the observer and the possibly dead cat split into an observer looking at a box with a dead cat and an observer looking at a box with a live cat. Since the dead and alive states are decoherent, there's no effective communication or interaction between them. I personally don't really like the many worlds or parallel universe interpretation. I think that for me, I don't know what do I know, but the Copenhagen interpretation seems most likely to me. I think it would be too laborious for the universe to be constructed with these infinite parallel worlds where all the decisions keep splitting off forever and ever. I think it would be tedious, really. So Amit Goswami in Physics of the Soul writes, the consciousness of the subject in a subject-object experience is the same consciousness as the ground of all being. Therefore, consciousness is unitive. There is only one subject consciousness, and we are that consciousness. So that's kind of the basic statement of the sort of monistic idealist idea. So some of this relationships between quantum physics and mysticism, or we could say esoteric science, as Deanna was talking about. The monistic idealism paradigm, consciousness is the fundamental reality. Physical stuff is a projection of that unitary indivisible consciousness, the I am that. There's a higher dimension of space-time where everything we experience as happening for a limited perspective has already occurred, or it's once again our language kind of blocks us here, but there's a dimension beyond our limited perspective space-time in which everything has already occurred or has occurred in kind of a simultaneous all-at-onceness. If we talk about this idea of moksha, enlightenment, or realization, it would be a shift in our identification from the ego-based level to recognizing ourselves as that that non-dual, unitary, indivisible level. And also, we can't be separate or observe reality. We are always participating in it and creating it in some sense. So Robert Lanza, I don't know if people know this book, Biocentrism. Very, very interesting. I mean, he, I think it's very similar philosophy ultimately to Goswami's. From a biological perspective, he looks at how his perspective is that consciousness has constructed the universe and the world in such a way in order to have the experience that we're having. Yeah, it's like fine-tuned for the existence of for the development, the evolution of consciousness, and so on. Consciousness creates the physical universe for the emergence of self-aware organisms. Space and time are not real things, but mental constructs, tools for our perceptions. Lanza writes, some may imagine there are two worlds, one out there and a separate one being cognized inside the skull. But the two worlds model is a myth. Nothing is perceived except the perceptions themselves, and nothing exists outside of consciousness. If time is an illusion, if reality is created by our own consciousness, can this consciousness ever truly be extinguished? Robert asks, Lanza asks, and he ends up, basically feeling that the biocentric worldview leads to, some level of certainty in there being some form of afterlife experience. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change form. The essence of who you are, which is energy, can neither diminish nor go away. There simply isn't any way in which to go. We inhabit a closed system. Goswami borrows from the work of Douglas Hofstadter, who wrote Gödel, Escher, Bach, and also a book called I Am a Strange Loop. If there is ultimately this, there's only unitary, indivisible consciousnness, how do we end up having an experience of a separate identity, an egoic-based identity? It's funny because I always remember, when my daughter was maybe 2 or something, she used to refer to herself in the third person. And it took a while for her to see herself as an I. So I found that quite fascinating. I think that's a universal phenomenon. So on the one hand, that's reinforced through culture, like everyone is calling her name and trying to get her to point to herself and say her name. So ultimately, you understand that you have a name, that you're separate, from the totality, you're this identification, and so on. Hofstadter and Goswami argue that our sense of separate identity is developed through something called a tangled hierarchy. Examples of this are the man from Crete who says all Cretans are liars, but then how could that be possible? If he's from Crete, then you're sort of stuck in this, constant loop, or the Escher drawings of the two hands drawing each other, or these kind of endless staircases or levels that return back to the original place. We at some point in our development, we discover such a strange loop, and it's in that recognition that we kind of jump out of that to have this illusory kind of understanding of ourselves as an I or an ego separate from the totality. The strange loop phenomenon occurs whenever, by moving upwards or downwards through levels of some hierarchical system, we unexpectedly find ourselves right back where we started. So we can look at the psychological I or ego as a kind of necessary narrative fiction built out of symbolic structures. And yeah, my perspective is really that, if we are all ultimately, this indivisible consciousness, that consciousness cannot actually have an experience of itself without creating some form of separation. So it needs to develop, there's a necessity, let's say, in developing separate kind of containers of consciousness who can then reflect on consciousness itself, explore, invent, create, within consciousness. Another element in this sort of new paradigm is synchronicity. F. David Peed is a physicist who worked with David Bohm. He wrote a wonderful book, Synchronicity, the bridge between matter and mind. And he talked about synchronicities as the jokers in nature's pack of cards, for they refuse to play by the rules, and they offer a hint that in our quest for certainty about the universe, we have ignored some vital clues. Carl Jung looked at the subject with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli and wrote a book called Synchronicity, an Acausal Ordering Principle, in which he noted that synchronistic phenomena prove the simultaneous occurrence of meaningful equivalences in heterogeneous, causally unrelated processes. In other words, they prove that a content perceived by an observer can at the same time be represented by an outside event without any causal connection. From this, it follows either the psyche cannot be localized in time, or that space is relative to the psyche. In another discussion, Jung said that ultimately it suggests that mind and matter are different forms of the same thing. And Jung's book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he recounts many amazing synchronicities. I mean, one that I recall is, I think he had a dream one night of a patient, shooting himself or something, and then he discovered that had happened during the night. Another, I can't remember exactly. There was one where he was talking with a patient about an analogy of an insect or something like that, and then that insect appeared on the windowsill. Anyway, I mean, Jung very much was kind of like a kind of modern Western shaman who was kind of surrounded by an ambience of like psychic and paranormal experience and synchronicity. Yeah, so just some more, a little deeper into physics of the soul. Goswami writes, there is no manifest quantum object until we see it, even if the object is the entire cosmos. There is no manifest cosmos, only possibilities, until the first sentient being, presumably the first living cell, observes the universe. That observation collapses the universe, along with the entire causal pathway that led to that first sentience retroactively. And the observation is self-referential. The sentience of that first living cell is co-created along with the universe. So yeah, just a totally like fascinating, different angle on from the kind of materialist idea of a kind of linear cause and effect evolutionary process. So if we have objects correlated not only across space but also across time, conscious choice and collapse of the causal pathway at any point of time will precipitate the entire pathway. The point to realize is that in quantum physics, there is neither space nor time until consciousness has chosen to collapse an event. Yeah, I mean, Goswami and Capra, I mean, I point out the kind of how a lot of the, ancient Buddhist and Vedic knowledge, really seems to have a understanding of sort of quantum universe from the inside. Much as that Nagarjuna quote that we mentioned earlier, Ashvagosha talked about something called suchness or tathagata. Suchness is neither that which is existence or that which is not, or that which is non-existence, nor that which is at once existence and non-existence, nor that which is not at once existence and non-existence. Very much like the quantum phenomena, the wavical. And so basically what Goswami does in physics of the soul is he looks at how these new understandings from quantum physics, which match up with ancient knowledge, allow us to sort of construct a kind of scientific hypothesis around how reincarnation could take place. He proposes there's kind of like different kind of aspects of the individual. And the three main ones that he defines are the ego, the classical self, the quantum monad, and the quantum self in his terminology. So yeah, the ego is the classical self, the conditioned self. The ego becomes increasingly conditioned in its patterns as we get older, but there's always that possibility to break free of those patterns, according to Goswami. Then Goswami talks about the quantum monad, which is sort of the intermediary between the ego, the egoic self, and the quantum self, the theme body that reincarnates in life after life. So the quantum monad for Goswami is actually the element that reincarnates. So essentially, as we live, we have our patterns of thinking, willing, feeling, action, and these are forming kind of quantum aggregates that remain connected non-locally after we die. And then these quantum aggregates seek to kind of continue the process that was happening, and so they look for another, sort of automatically seek to incarnate another body to sort of continue the journey that they're on. And then beyond the ego and the quantum monad, Goswami talks about something that he calls the quantum self, which is basically that part of us which is totally undifferentiated from that pure consciousness, pure creativity flow, the unconditioned kind of ultimate reality. The ego, the classical self, as I said, it develops habitual patterns of thought and behavior as we live. Like we can see as we get older, like we tend to repeat our thoughts become more, we're not as fresh to new phenomena. We're more trapped in our past perceptions and so on. Once we learn a task, that for any situation involving it, the likelihood that the corresponding memory will trigger a conditioned response approaches 100%. But as I said, Goswami points out that we always have the possibility to break out of conditioning. And this is probably also something we saw in the kind of psilocybin studies in Johns Hopkins, where they gave psilocybin to normal adults, sane adults who never had a psychedelic experience before. And many of them saw it as one of the most amazing experiences of their lives, on a par with the birth of their first child or their marriage. And one thing that they noted in psychological exams they gave them 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years after, is that they had permanent changes in some of their psychological tendencies, which tend to become more predictable with age. So one of them was that they had a much greater amount of openness to new experience. So it's very interesting. It does seem that psychedelics have like a kind of demonstrable effect at kind of keeping the ego more supple and flexible if they're used properly, at least. And Goswami notes that in the same way that classical Newtonian physics is now seen as a subset of quantum physics, behaviorist psychology can be recognized as a special case of the more general quantum picture. Behaviorism is that tendency of our, normal self or egoic self to become kind of totally patterned and conditioned, to not be fresh, to sort of become stale, just repeating experience over and over again. We definitely see it with parents, old people, and so on. But then that's only a part of the larger possibilities that are available to us in the self. The quantum monad, the identity that survives from one incarnation to another. So it's that aggregate of thinking, feeling, and willing that somehow exists in this quantum realm. It sort of automatically seeks to perpetuate itself and to find another body and continue its journey in form. And it's a level of individuality that is intermediate between the ego and the quantum self. You can also think of it as the theme body, or Goswami talks about the Jivatman or Jiva in East Indian traditions. In this book by James Matlock, which we'll look at later in the course, called Signs of Reincarnation, he develops something that he calls the processual soul theory. And he talks about the stream of consciousness that animates a body during life, that continues into death and persists through death until it becomes associated with, possesses another body, generally one not yet born. That's a similar concept. And Rudolf Steiner has a similar idea. I think he talked about it as the theme body. Then for Goswami, you have the quantum self, that aspect of our being that is the universal consciousness itself. I mean, I guess in some sense that actually is all there is. Everything else is just, transitory, temporary illusion. But that illusion is still persistent, and it's still kind of who we are in a way. That would be Paramatman or Atman in the Goswami's Indian tradition. It would be pure creativity, flow. F. David Pete, in his book on synchronicities, talks about how synchronicities, epiphanies, peak and mystical experiences are all cases in which creativity breaks through the barriers of the self and allows awareness to flood through the whole domain of consciousness. It is the human mind operating for a moment in its true order and moving through orders of increasing subtlety, reaching past the source of mind and matter into creativity itself. So that's kind of the quantum self in its proper domain. And we in our lives we have moments, whether when we fall in love, when we make something beautiful, when we create art, where we're really kind of united with that quantum self and its infinite field of potentiality. So that's a picture of Goswami, cute guy. So he talks about these distinct patterns of conditioned thought, feeling, and action, which continue from life to life and form these kind of quantum aggregates. And that he believes that what he's talking about here are the same as what the mystical traditions talk about as the subtle bodies. The mental body represents the individual's thought pattern as a kind of quantum aggregate. The vital body is made up of the individual's pattern of action and feeling. A particular and individual quantum monad develops these vital and mental memories of past contexts over successive lives. which sort of drive its further incarnational kind of journey. And yet beyond these habitual tendencies that are become worn like grooves in an old record, there's a body that Goswami talks about as the supermental intellect, containing the archetypal themes that shape the movements of the physical, mental, and vital bodies. Yeah, these are two traditions: the Kabbalistic tradition on the right, and I believe it's the sort of Hindu tradition on the left, where we talk about these different bodies, these kind of sheets: the physical body, the vital body, the mental body, the supermental intellect, the body of bliss, limitless body. And similarly with Kabbalah, you have the physical body, the body of manifestation, formation, creation, pure thought, and then sort of the unity consciousness, the indivisible oneness. And I think this is my last slide. This is from a Sufi philosopher who is a very difficult person to study and read, but I feel like I've really gotten a lot of interesting ideas from him. He wrote a book called The Transcendent Unity of Religions, where he looked at kind of the how, I mean, you have Islam and Judaism and Christianity kind of in conflict on the sort of exoteric level, but there's actually an esoteric level where they don't really conflict, and it can be understood as a process that's unfolding through history in a way. But anyway, in this particular quote, Schuon talks about what he talks about: the sufficient reason for the existence of the human creature is the capacity to think, not to think just anything, but to think about what matters, and finally about what alone matters. Man is the only being on earth able to foresee death, and who desires to know and is capable of knowing the why of the world. No one can deny that it is in the fundamental nature of man to ask himself these questions and to have, in consequence, the right to answers, and further to have access to them precisely by virtue of this right, whether through revelation or through intellection. Each of these sources of knowledge acting according to its own laws and within the framework of the conditions that correspond to it. So yeah, I mean, for me, I felt really connected to this idea that that something, somehow, like, one of the reasons we're actually here is to think about and reflect upon kind of the ultimate nature of reality, death and life. And it's just funny how that is kind of so suppressed and taboo in our society. It's like this sort of this basic aspect of our being, is considered ridiculous, in postmodern industrial society. You're supposed to be focused on, I was in the cafe this morning and the woman next to me was, shopping for shoes online for hours. We're supposed to be focused on, these, people are brainwashed, mind controlled into being focused on these very shallow goals. Whereas we really have this, profound ability as human creatures to reflect on the nature of reality, and so on. And that the two techniques that Schuon talks about for accomplishing this are revelation or intellection. And I was excited when I read that, because that's, I feel, what I've been doing in my work. I mean, for me, the path of revelation has been, psychedelic shamanism, ayahuasca, iboga, DMT, and so on. And then intellection is all the, research, philosophy, thinking, seeking to understand for all these other authors, and then trying to put those, the revelation and the intellection together into kind of a coherent pattern. Thank you so much, everybody. It was great to meet you, and I really appreciate your attention, and look forward to hanging out again in a week.